The Price of Carbon was researched and written over a 2.5 year period, and my objective in writing the book was to distill the findings and conclusions of world expert organizations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency on the subjects of climate change and climate policy into an objective, fact-based narrative for a general audience. My name is Dave Mains. I am the author of The Price of Carbon, and I would like to thank you for your interest in one of the more important issues of our time. Over the course of this presentation, I will provide an overview of the subject matter conclusions contained in The Price of Carbon. We'll start with a very simple question. Anthropogenic or man-made climate change, is this real? And how certain are we of this reality? To answer this question, we'll start with an examination of energy demand over the past 200 years or so. By the year 1900, the disruptive innovations of the Industrial Revolution had evolved and spread amongst advanced economies around the world. Coal fueled the Industrial Revolution, and by 1900, global coal production had increased by 370-fold. During the first half of the 20th century, energy demand and the rate of emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases continued to increase. However, any effect on climate was marginal. By mid-century, advances in agriculture had increased global food production capacity, and this facilitated the beginnings of a world population explosion that continues to this day. Increased populations coincided with post-Second World War economic booms in advanced economies around the world. Energy demand increased as a result of growing more affluent populations in developed countries, and in latter decades, energy-intensive industries were established in China and other emerging economies. With time, oil and natural gas, and in more recent years, hydro, renewables, and nuclear diversified the overall mix of energy sources. By 1957, scientists at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography developed the hypothesis that with continuously increasing rates of energy use, the potential existed for CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion to accumulate in the atmosphere at sufficient concentrations to elevate surface temperatures. To test this hypothesis, a monitoring station was established 2 miles above the tree line on the Hawaiian island of Mauna Loa. This station has been in operation ever since and is now one of over 100 stations located around the globe that continuously measure atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. CO2 in the atmosphere undergoes an annual cycle with a peak in May and a minimum in October. This pattern is driven by seasonal variations in plant growth in the Northern Hemisphere. Atmospheric CO2 has steadily increased over the past 60 years, and on February 14, 2018, was reported at 408 parts per million. This concentration equates to a 46% increase relative to pre-industrial concentrations. There are no natural sources for such a massive accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. Further, the measured quantity of atmospheric carbon dioxide correlates directly to the quantity of emissions from the activities of man that should have accumulated in the atmosphere since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Since the late 1800s, average surface temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius. This measured change in temperature corresponds directly to the theoretical effects of accumulating greenhouse gases. So in answer to the first question, indeed, anthropogenic or man-made climate change is real. And since the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the activities of man have led to an accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at sufficient concentrations to increase average surface temperatures by 1 degree Celsius. Now that we have established the reality of man-made climate change, the next question is, what will happen under various scenarios of future climate change? The reports of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change focus on 4 scenarios of future emissions. These are termed representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. The RCP 8.5 model is based on a business as usual continuation of current practices, whereby emissions remain coupled to population and economic growth. Under this scenario, by the end of the century, atmospheric CO2 concentrations would be over threefold greater than pre-industrial levels. In contrast, under the RCP 2.6 models of successful implementation of aggressive measures to curtail emissions, emissions would peak by the year 2020 and decline to net zero accumulation during the second half of the century. Under this scenario, atmospheric CO2 would be held to less than 450 parts per million. Intermediate models arrive at peak emissions in the year 2040 and 2080. Estimates for end-of-century average surface temperatures are then calculated based on future concentrations of greenhouse gases. Relative to pre-industrial times, under the business-as-usual scenario, average surface temperatures are projected to increase by 5 degrees Celsius. If, however, atmospheric CO2 is held below 450 ppm, surface warming will be maintained below 2 degrees Celsius. Intermediary scenarios would see 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in surface warming. The IPCC divides the world into geographical areas for assessment of risks and vulnerability to climate change. Africa, Asia, and small islands are the most at-risk regions on Earth, with a greater vulnerability to climate change damage and less capacity for adaptation when compared to North and South America, Europe, and Australia plus New Zealand. A future of unmitigated climate change will have devastating impacts on African nations. Under the business-as-usual scenario, inland hotspots of extreme surface warming will be common to all continents. In Africa, these hotspots will be 6 degrees or higher above current temperatures. These conditions will result in a high frequency and severity of extreme weather events. Crop failures and failures of food and water supply could result in famine and disease outbreak. Secondary outcomes include political instability, climate migration, impoverishment, and human conflict. In comparison, a scenario of aggressive abatement of future emissions will limit surface warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, and this will allow for adoption of modern agricultural practices. In addition, there will be adequate capacity to adapt to modest changes in weather patterns. Under these conditions, economic growth and poverty alleviation will be uncoupled from greenhouse gas emissions. 90% of the additional energy retained by the planet with accumulating greenhouse gases will be taken up by the world's oceans. Thermal expansion of the oceans plus discharge of glacial meltwaters will lead to rising sea levels in direct correlation with the magnitude of future surface warming. Small islands are at particular risk of sea level rise. The Maldives is an island nation with a population of 400,000 located in the Indian Oceans. The Maldives are the lowest country on Earth, with 80% of the land mass located less than 1 meter above sea level. Sea level rise based on a future scenario of extreme climate change will likely lead to abandonment of the Maldives Islands before the end of the centuries. Asia accounts for 90% of the global population exposed to tropical cyclones. Of the 130 port cities defined as at risk of storm surge flooding, 10 cities account for half of the total population, and all but Miami and New York are located in Asia. Under a business-as-usual scenario, climate change-dependent sea level rise will increase the potency of storm surges, such that what was a 1 in 100-year storm will have the damage potential of a future 1 in 10-year storm. Sir Nicholas Stern is the former chief economist of the World Bank and is currently the chair of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change in the London School of Economics. Nicholas Stern is among the world experts on climate financing. The first 3 conclusions of Stern's nearly 700-page report on the cost of climate change reads as follows. Climate change will affect the basic elements of life for people around the world, access to water, food production, and to the environment. All countries will be affected. The most vulnerable, the poorest countries, will suffer earliest and most. The overall cost of climate change will be the equivalent of losing 5% of global GDP per year. If a wider range of risks and impact are taken into account, estimates of damage could rise to 20% of GDP or more. Given the extreme costs and damage potential of unmitigated climate change, the next question is, what are we doing about it? By the late 1980s, the emerging body of scientific evidence of man-made climate change led the World Meteorological Organization, along with the United Nations, to form the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. On 5-year intervals, the IPCC publishes comprehensive, in-depth reports on the science of climate change and on the pathways of adaptation and mitigations to minimize or avoid future damage. The fifth assessment report came out in 2014 with over 10,000 scientists, economists, and other experts contributing to the 5,000-page package. One of the core objectives of the IPCC is to provide policymakers with the required synthesis of factual information and conclusions on which to base decisions for the design of effective climate action plan. The IPCC is the global authority on climate change, and in 2007 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change and to lay the foundations for measures that are needed to counteract such change. In 2005, the Kyoto Protocol came into effect as the first international climate policy agreement specifically designed to achieve targets to control future emissions. Universal agreement was not reached in that the US, China, India, and developing countries did not participate with binding emissions targets. Canada ratified the accord, but in late 2011, when it became evident that Canada would not meet its Kyoto targets, Canada became the only country to withdraw from the agreement. Between 1990 and 2012, global emissions increased by 40%. And based on this statistic, the Kyoto Protocol could be called a failure. However, declaring the Kyoto Protocol to be an outright failure is overly simplistic. Countries that did participate with binding targets cut emissions by 13% and thus grossly exceeded the first reporting period target of a 5% reduction. The increase in global emissions was driven by China and other non-participant nations, with China accounting for half of the increased emissions. As of 2012, 22% of global emissions came from China, with the US contributing another 12%. The countries of the European Union, plus the 8 other top emitters, contribute 67% of global emissions, with Canada accounting for 1.7% of the total. One could argue that whatever Canada does or does not accomplish to cut emissions will be of no consequence. However, 33% of global emissions come from Canada, plus countries with comparable or lower total emissions. The responsibility is global, and the magnitude of absolute emissions from a given country or subnational region does not absolve regional responsibility to contribute to the global effort to combat climate change. The growing concerns over continuously escalating rates of emissions and the past failures to achieve universal agreement called for a new approach to developing an international climate accord. The 2015 Paris Agreement was designed to establish an agreed-upon limit to future surface warming, with each country setting their own targets to control future emissions. Each country was asked to submit a nationally determined contribution, and the aggregate effort would then be tallied to project global emissions in relation to the overarching objective to limit future surface warming. Article 2 is the centerpiece of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, and it reads, global average surface temperature increases should be held to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, and efforts shall be pursued to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C. Nationally determined contributions, as submitted by individual countries, generally make use of a baseline reference rate of emissions, and then set future targets to control emissions relative to this baseline. Canada's NDC, as submitted under the Harper government, pledged a 30% cut in emissions by 2030 when compared to emissions on record for the year 2005. Many developing countries submitted a combination of an unconditional NDC and a more ambitious document that was conditional to an international cooperation, technology transfer, and access to international climate funds. NDCs are not meant to be static documents and can be updated at any time, but must be updated within 5-year intervals with the intent of progressively increasing the level of ambition to curtail future emissions. The IPCC and the International Energy Agency have determined budgets of remaining greenhouse gases that can be safely released to the atmosphere, such that end-of-century surface temperatures are aligned with the core objective of the Paris Agreement. The most cost-effective pathways to achieve this objective are for emissions to peak around the year 2020 and then to decline in an orderly fashion, arriving at net zero accumulation sometime around the year 2075. The budget of emissions under the 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway is considerably less, such that deeper cuts are required by 2030 and 2050, and arriving at net zero emission occurs 15 years ahead of the less than 2 degrees Celsius pathway. The current set of NDCs are not aligned with these models, and peak emissions are projected to extend past the year 2030. If emissions were to follow projections based on current policies, the global budget would be seriously overspent and surface temperatures would increase by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. Under this scenario, inaction on our part will impose the substantial costs and hardships of serious climate change damage on future generations. About 25% of global emissions come from the production of electricity plus a small amount of heat production. The industry and building sectors consume most of this electricity. Fossil fuel combustion and CO2 release account for the bulk of emissions from the industry, transportation, and buildings sectors. The integrated sectors of agriculture, forestry, and other land use account for 24% of global emissions, and this is divided equally between agriculture and forestry and other land use. The major sources of emissions from agriculture are methane from ruminant animals and nitrous oxide from fertilizer production, along with CO2 release from agricultural practices. Net CO2 release from forest degradation and deforestation and peatland degradations are the major sources of emissions from the forestry subsector. Emissions that are classified as other energy consist of methane and CO2 from oil and gas sector activities. This is an example of a climate change mitigation model from the IPCC that is designed to limit future surface warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. In this model, CO2 emissions are shown across economic sectors and are treated separately from emissions of nitrous oxide and methane. Over time, CO2 emissions are driven down by a combination of improved energy efficiencies, fuel switching to zero and low emissions options, and the adoption of carbon capture and storage technologies. After all practical abatements are in place, residual emissions, primarily consisting of methane and nitrous oxide from the world agriculture sectors, are unavoidable. To offset these emissions, the world forestry sector transitions to net carbon dioxide withdrawal through massive programs of afforestation, reforestation, and forest and peatland preservations. However, there are serious concerns as to the land availability to establish this biomass of plants. Most models assume that carbon capture and storage technology will be applied to the production of electricity from the combustion of bioenergy. In this particular model, the electricity supply sector transitions to net carbon dioxide withdrawal through establishing a global fleet of bioenergy plants equipped with CCS. Industrial withdrawal of carbon dioxide in combination with the world forest then provides sufficient capacity to offset residual emissions. Bioenergy production with carbon capture and storage technology is technically feasible. Sustainably grown forest, or more likely, farmed energy crops would function to withdraw carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during the growth stage of the plant. The biomass would then be sustainably harvested and combusted to produce electricity at utilities with carbon capture technology. The captured CO2 would then be transported to injection sites for isolation from the biosphere in deep saline aquifers. The storage capacities of these aquifers is immense, and they are well distributed across the planet, such that geological storage is unlikely to be an impediment. However, these power plants will be costly to build and operate and will be dependent on effective programs of land use management plus potent carbon pricing mechanisms. The utility would be paid for the production of electricity and would also be paid per unit of CO2 withdrawn from the atmosphere and isolated from the biosphere. The International Energy Agency has developed models for emissions from the global electricity supply sector based on a new policy scenario that follows targets contained in the current set of low-ambition global policies and an alternate scenario whereby atmospheric CO2 concentrations are held below 450 ppm as required to limit future surface warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. By the year 2040, under the new policy scenario, emissions are similar to current rates. Under the 450 scenario, however, deep decarbonization of the electricity supply sector must be in place by 2040. This would follow improved energy efficiencies to reduce electricity demand, plus increased grid penetration by zero-emissions hydro, solar, wind, and nuclear power. The International Energy Agency anticipates that carbon capture and storage will be a significant contributor to global decarbonization of electricity generation by the year 2040. The last question that I will ask pertains to climate action plans. What are they and what will they cost? Meaningful climate action plans begin with clearly defined specific targets to control future emissions. Policies are then developed to achieve these targets. These policies can consist of specific legislation to improve energy efficiencies or to limit emissions from a defined source. Examples would include energy efficiency standards applied to electronics and vehicles, enhanced building codes, and mandated increased electricity grid penetration by renewables, along with incentives for building retrofits or switching to zero-emission vehicles. Carbon pricing mechanisms are key components of well-designed climate action plans. By applying a price to carbon, practices will naturally evolve toward lower cost, lower emissions options. As such, overall economy-wide emissions reduction will follow cost-effective, market-driven pathways. With emissions trading schemes or cap-and-trade system, a cap is placed on total emissions from a given economic sector or sectors. Permits that total up to this cap are then issued or sold at auction to emitters falling under the systems. These permits can then be bought and sold on the open market. At the end of the reporting period, emissions from a given entity must be less than permits in hand or the company will be fined. A carbon tax applies specifically to the emissions potential of a given product, and these are usually applied to fossil fuels. Carbon taxes can be revenue neutral, with funds distributed from the government back to industry, the farming sector, and the general public. Globally, emissions trading schemes predominate over carbon taxes. The well-established EU ETS covers 45% of emissions and is the core component of climate action plans designed to achieve deep decarbonization of European economies by mid-century. In California, a broad-spectrum ETS covering 85% of state emissions has been in operation since 2013. Annual cap reductions of these systems are designed to achieve a 40% cut in emissions by 2030, advancing to an 80% cut by mid-century. This rate of curtailment follows IPCC recommendations for advanced economies, as required to contribute to the global effort to limit future surface warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. In December of 2017, China launched an ETS as part of an emerging substantial climate action plan from the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. This system covers 33% of national emissions and is by far the largest cap and trade system in the world. In Canada, Ontario and Quebec have implemented cap-and-trade systems that are similar to the California ETS. In January of 2018, the Ontario ETS linked to the California-Quebec system to facilitate the exchange of permits between companies operating within these jurisdictions. The climate action plans of Ontario and Quebec are designed to achieve deep decarbonization with at least an 80% cut in emissions by 2050. As of now, carbon pricing mechanisms cover 26% of global emissions. The cost of climate action plans vary with the specifics of policies implemented. Plans that exclude carbon pricing mechanisms are less effective in achieving economy-wide curtailments, and these come at a higher cost per unit of emissions avoidance. A study published by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development concluded that a global cap-and-trade system covering 100% of emissions with unfettered access to available technologies could achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement at a marginal cost of less than 0.3% of global gross domestic product. An idealized universal carbon pricing mechanism is unlikely to evolve for the foreseeable future, and the IPCC estimates that a more realistic mixture of effective climate action plans will come at a global cost of between 1 to 2% of GDP by the year 2050. A recent study by the Government of Canada estimates that under a business-as-usual scenario, GDP would increase by 11.5% between 2014 and 2030. Achieving the objectives of Canada's NDC will reduce year 2030 GDP somewhere between 1 to 3%, and this is dependent on the uniformity of carbon pricing mechanisms and the details of cash flows and provincial climate action plans that are applied across the country. In Chapter 6 of The Price of Carbon, the climate action plans of the top emitting countries are reviewed. This excerpt is taken from the section on Canada's Climate Action Plan. Canada is a net exporter of fossil fuels with extensive coal, oil, and natural gas deposits that are concentrated in the western provinces of Saskatchewan and Alberta. In 2014, the oil and gas sector accounted for 26% of national emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions from the fossil fuel-rich provinces have steadily increased since 1990, while emissions from the remaining regions of the country have declined slightly. By 2014, only 15% of Canada's population lived in Saskatchewan and Alberta. However, this region of the country accounted for 48% of national emissions. On a per capita basis, during 2014, 67 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent were released per person residing in Saskatchewan and Alberta. This rate of emissions was over five-fold greater than per capita emissions from the remaining regions of the country. Oil and gas sector activities in Saskatchewan and Alberta are major contributors to Canada's excess rate of per capita greenhouse gas emissions. Given the magnitude of emissions from the oil and gas sector in Canada, opposition to effective measures to limit these emissions is an opposition to reducing total national greenhouse gas emissions and, through inaction, a form of climate change denial. Recently, Canada has begun to deviate from the political inaction and indifference that has characterized climate change policy development since 2002. In November of 2015, the Alberta government announced the Climate Leadership Plan. Alberta has introduced a carbon tax and placed an emission cap on oil sands operations. In addition, Alberta's plan matches the federal directives to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sector by 45%, and to phase out coal-fired power plants by the year 2030. With rollout of the Ontario ETS and startup of Alberta's carbon tax, 86% of the population in Canada will live in jurisdictions with some form of carbon pricing in force. On October 3, 2016, the Government of Canada announced that, beginning in 2018, all provinces must have carbon pricing mechanisms in operation. Based on recent activities at the federal and provincial level, Canada has embarked on an aggressive set of climate action plans. In the short term, Alberta's carbon tax, cap on oil sands emissions, and the initiatives to limit methane emissions will be important measures to control emissions from the oil and gas sector. Moving forward to mid-centuries, as economies progressively decarbonize, domestic and export markets for oil and gas will diminish and eventually vanish. Declining demand will be the long-term driver of deep emissions cuts from Canada's fossil fuel sector. This graph shows International Energy Agency projections for future oil demand based on the current set of global policies and on the 450 scenario to limit future surface warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Under current policies, oil demand would continue to increase, but at a slower rate than was the case prior to dismissal of NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Based on current policies, the International Energy Agency estimates a global cost to the oil sector of $11 trillion to develop the supply sufficient to meet future demand. If, however, global policies were aligned with the 450 scenario, demand for oil would drop by 25% by the year 2030, and the cost of developing this supply would drop to about $6.8 trillion. Under a disjointed pathway, whereby demand continues to grow until the year 2030, followed by the introduction of drastic measures to curtail emissions, the oil and gas sector would be unable to effectively plan for changes in demand and would incur massive losses through stranded assets and wildly fluctuating prices. Some may consider this list of large corporations as intransient promoters of the status quo for a business-as-usual continuation of traditional energy use. These are the founding corporate members of the Climate Leadership Council. The CLC is a policy institute that is actively lobbying Congress to pass legislation for immediate implementation of a $40 per ton carbon fee that would be applied to fossil fuels. What industry wants, and indeed requires for long-term business planning, is clarity of purpose as to the future direction of climate policies. Man-made climate change is real, as is the future damage potential of unchecked emissions. The intergenerational responsibility requires us to act decisively on this issue and should not be ignored. The conversation on climate policy must advance beyond left-right political ideologies, and political leaders must have the vision to plan beyond the constraints of short-term electoral cycles. Discussions should and must focus on the reality of climate change and how to progressively decarbonize economic sectors as cost-effectively as possible. Science, and by extension, the principles of enlightenment and humanisms, are threatened by climate change deniers in positions of authority. Climate change deniers include politicians and leaders of industry that play games with the public by professing a belief to man-made climate change while doing little to actually address the issue. There is no moral or economic foundation to argue against the implementation of effective climate action plans. How we respond to this issue over the next 10 to 15 years is dependent on rationality overcoming irrational short-term thinking, or more precisely, a lack of thinking by those opposed to dealing with one of the most important issues of our times. Thank you for your attention, and for more information, I would encourage you to visit www.thepriceofcarbon.com.